Okay, so let's jump into this. My name is Vince, and I just want to welcome everyone to another presentation of Novedge's Best of the Best webinar series. We're really excited today not only to be presenting KeyShot, but to have Brian Townsend on board presenting for us. Before we get started, I just want to give a little background on Brian. He's the digital media artist at Luxian. He is responsible for training, service work, and all graphical elements of the KeyShot brand for print and web. Brian holds a bachelor's degree in computer animation from the Art Institute in San Diego. So we're really thankful for Brian for doing this. I think we're in for a tremendous presentation. Brian's going to speak for the next 40 minutes or so. During that time, everyone will be in listen-only mode, but please feel free to shoot your questions into the question box. At the end, we'll open it up for a Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions as time allows. We will be recording this webinar, so if you have to leave early for any reason, we'll give you links through email as soon as the webinar is over. Having said all that, I want to turn it over to Brian so we can get right into his presentation. Brian, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Ready to go.
Cool. I'm going to switch the screen to you and let you take it from here.
Okay. All right. Can everybody see the screen? Can you see that, Vince?
Yep, I can see it. Looks good.
Great. So, all right. As Vince said, I'm a digital media artist, and I use KeyShot for product rendering for marketing purposes. I've been using the software since 2008, and I know it inside and out. And really, how powerful a tool it is to create renders for marketing purposes. So, what we're going to be doing today is basically replicating a marketing image of an actual product. So of these two images you see here, one is a render and one is an actual marketing photo. And so we're going to replicate everything from the materials to the actual lighting, and we're going to separate everything into layers so that you have ultimate control over every little element of this image. Because KeyShot's generally used for a couple different tasks. It's heavily used by industrial designers and engineers to quickly communicate design ideas to members of their team. But there's also a group of users who use it for marketing purposes, and they basically take KeyShot and push it to the next level to really break down every little element of an image and get ultimate control over that image. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is that way to use the tool. So let's go ahead and take a look at the render that we're creating. This is the actual rendered version. So in case you were wondering, this image on the right is going to be the marketing photo, and this is the image that we're going to be recreating using KeyShot. And also, when we're doing these marketing images, we render things out at very, very high resolution. And the reason we do it at high resolution is because when it comes down to making edits and doing photo touch-up, when you're touching up your images, when they're rendered at high resolution, it's a lot more forgiving when you make mistakes. I suggest using a Wacom tablet and do your touch-up using that. And if you have a little shift of your hand that isn't supposed to go a certain direction, it's a lot more forgiving when you're working with a lot of different pixels as opposed to if you're working at an image that's this size. Your mistakes are a lot more noticeable that way. Also, when you render images out at high resolution and then you scale them down, all that detail condenses down into the smaller image, and you get a much higher quality image. So even if I'm rendering something that's supposed to be a final image at this size, I tend to still do at least an image that's 4,000 pixels wide so that we can capture all this detail. And one of the things that you'll notice about KeyShot is it's great for doing high-resolution images, and it's great for being able to import high-detail models. You don't really have to be concerned with the size of your 3D model when using KeyShot, because KeyShot does not rely on the graphics card. Everything that KeyShot does in terms of rendering is done on the CPU. So that means it can run on just about any machine, and you can get really high performance. This image and most of the images that I do are all created from my laptop. So it's a great tool in that regard. So let's go ahead and take a look here. I was able to get this model from grabcad.com from this user here. And this is the model that we're going to be using today. So let's go ahead and move over into KeyShot, and let's start this process. So go ahead and start KeyShot, and when you start the application, it's going to look something like this. And what you want to do is import your data, and you can do so by either clicking the Import button, or if you have your model, you can drag and drop it into the UI, and your icon will switch, and that lets you know that you can import this file type. Also, as far as file types that are able to be imported, if you click here on the import drop-down menu, you can see all the different file types that KeyShot supports. And it's really more and more becoming the rendering application that's universal to just about any CAD package. The list is constantly growing, so and it will continue to grow. So let's go ahead and import this model, and you're going to be presented with some settings on import. You can pretty much leave all of these at default, but one thing I want to suggest right away is clicking this Advanced tab and make sure that your tessellation quality is set all the way to 1. What that's going to do is that's going to make sure that any of your curves in your geometry have enough resolution to show up as a nice smooth curve and not a faceted curve. Like I said, KeyShot's great at handling large amounts of data. So always make sure this is turned up to the max value. So we'll press OK, and this will go ahead and import. And basically what it's doing in this import is it's converting all this surface data to polygons, because rendering applications need to work with polygons to be able to render a model. Okay, when the model comes in, it's going to look something like this. And the next thing you need to know is how to navigate your scene. So if you left-click in the scene, this will orbit your camera around, and your camera is always centered around a certain orbit point. And one thing that you can do to control your orbit point, which is a huge help, is press Control-Alt, and if you right-click on an area, it's going to center your camera around that orbit point. So if I wanted to orbit around this little frame here, I could do so. If you want to zoom in, you can hold Alt, and you right mouse, and you move in and out. Okay? If you want to pan your camera, you can hold down the middle mouse wheel, and you move your camera around. If at any time you're not sure what any of the hotkeys are, you can press the K key, and that's going to pull up the hotkey list. And this will tell you how to move all your camera. One hotkey I really can't emphasize how useful it is this Control-Alt-Right mouse. Like for example, if I wanted to work on this particular letter, I could Control-Alt, right-click there, and look, that centers my camera right around that point, so I can get right in there. A lot of times you'll notice your camera might end up with its orbit point out off to the side, and it's kind of hard to center your model in the frame. Just Control-Alt, right-click, and you'll always have that model in the center. Okay, so when you're ready to start assigning materials to your model, you can open up the library by clicking the library button down there. And the first tab in the list is going to be materials, and you can sort by category. So you can click different plastics, and there's different types that these are all organized into. You can just drag and drop a plastic on there, and it will be assigned. Generally, I like to create my materials from scratch, and that's what we're going to do today. It's just I found it's faster to do that over the years, and also I find that whatever I'm creating, the material library oftentimes can be a great start, but every product and every material that you render is different. So, and there's a lot of materials out there. So I like to start from scratch, and also if you start to create your materials from scratch, you're going to have a better understanding of how material creation in KeyShot works, and you're going to be a lot more self-sufficient when it comes to creating your own custom material. Now, the other thing in the library that you're going to want to pay attention to is the environment library. So this is where all your lighting is derived. And the great thing about this is what makes KeyShot so easy, because you can simply drag and drop an environment into the window, and this is what creates your lighting. So you get instant realistic 3D lighting based off of HDRI images. And you can rotate your lighting by pressing Control, and you left-click and drag, and this will orbit your environment. There's a lot of these studio-like environments that are great for product photography and things like that. And you'll also notice some other environments in here that are more photograph-based. And these are good for other things, sometimes automotive. But you'll notice that as soon as you drop this in, your lighting automatically reflects that environment. KeyShot has a very intelligent way to go about deriving light from these types of images. And these are special images, and they are 32-bit images. And let me just quickly explain what that is and why that's useful. It's useful not only for lighting, but also when you're rendering out images for marketing purposes. Let's take a look at this little diagram here I put together. So this kind of shows the comparison between an 8-bit image and a 32-bit image. And this will explain to you how KeyShot can use these special images for lighting purposes. So in a standard 8-bit image, if you've ever used Photoshop and you've been picking colors, you have a color range of 0 to 255. So 0 is going to be your darkest color when you have RGB 000. That's going to give you black. When you have RGB 255, that's going to give you white. So that's your brightest color in an 8-bit image, and black is your darkest color in an 8-bit image. Okay? Now the problem with that is if you look at something like this, and let's compare these two objects for a second. We have an LED and we have the sun. There's a vast difference in brightness between an LED and the sun. I mean, the sun is billions of times brighter than any LED. So when you look at this 0 to 255 range, you can't really accurately describe how much brighter the sun is than an LED by using this scale. So in a 32-bit image, your range is 0 to 1, where 111 equals white and 000 equals black. But what you can do is you can go way beyond that range, and you can basically get values that are higher than that. So if you look at this color blue, which has intensity, its RGB value is 16, 17, 20, when 111 is actually pure white. So we're basically working with brightness as well. And let me show you why that's actually useful. I have two images here that are going to look the same, but they're actually quite a bit different. And let me show you why. So this is one of the environment images that ships with KeyShot, and one of them is 32 bits, and the other is 8-bit. Okay, so here you can see this is RGB 32. And if I go to Image Adjustments Exposure, and I use this exposure setting, look at all the detail we still have in those lights. Okay, even if I darken this all the way down and press OK, and then I go back to exposure and I brighten it back up, all that detail is still retained in there. And if you look at the color picker when using this, you'll see that 32-bit scale. And the reason this is important for doing product rendering for marketing is if you render an image out that's overexposed or underexposed, you can always pull detail back in your highlights and shadows. If you look here, you can see that because this is a light source, it's actually quite a bit brighter than the other pixels surrounding it. So it's brighter than just pure white. Now, in comparison, if we do this on an 8-bit image, if we go brightness, contrast, if we darken this all the way down and reduce our contrast, and then we try to pull detail out of these shadows, we end up with a muddy gray. So there's no detail there. So I just wanted to touch on that very briefly so you understand the difference between 32-bit images and why they're important. Okay, so moving back into KeyShot, let's go ahead and start out with the startup environment. A lot of times I use this as my starting point. It's a nice, fairly neutral environment. It doesn't have a whole lot of contrast in it. And let's go ahead and start creating some materials here. So the first thing I'm going to do, if you want to edit a material on your model, you can double-click, and that's going to pull up the material properties. Okay? Currently, the type is set to diffuse. And I'm going to change this from diffuse over to plastic. And you can see that the plastic isn't very shiny right now. And I'm going to fix that simply by clicking on the specular colors here, and I'm going to start to bring this up. And that's going to start to make this material more reflective. Okay. Now let's compare the material that we're actually trying to reproduce here. I'll open up the original marketing image, and let's kind of cross-reference that with the material we're creating. Look here. Here's the marketing image. If we look, we have this kind of textured plastic here, has a nice highlight here, which is pretty much defined from your lighting, but we want to make sure that the material that we create is capable of picking up a highlight like this. So it's not perfectly reflective, so what we'll want to do is we want to start to add roughness to this. The other thing we're going to want to do is add a bump map. And a bump map is going to allow you to create subtle details like that textured plastic. So if we go under the Textures tab, we can go ahead and open up the bump. And these are textures that ship with KeyShot. And I'm going to go ahead and use this Splatter Normal. And I also want to make sure that Normal Map is checked down here because we are using a normal map. Okay, so if we zoom in here, let's take a look at what's going on. You can see that we do have this really cool texture pattern going on here. It's got some weird stretching, and that has to do with texture mapping. So basically on this pipe here, you're going to want to set this from UV coordinates to box map. And that's going to solve most of your texture mapping issues. Okay, now once you have your mapping set up, you can adjust your bump height by using this slider here. You can go negative values, you can go positive values. And that's going to increase or decrease the effect of this look here. You can also scale down your bump. So notice when I do that, it creates that texture, but it's a little bit smaller in scale. If I increase this, it can get bigger. Okay. I think we'll go ahead and go with something right about like here. Okay. And let's move on. So the other thing that we have is we have a sort of soft touch rubber material here, excuse me, for the focus ring. So let's go ahead and double click that, and we'll change the type from diffuse to plastic. And we'll set the diffuse color, which is basically going to be your overall color, down to a sort of black material. And let's increase the specular. So generally see me not setting this to full white for a black plastic, because if you set this to pure white, your specular highlights are going to be so hot that it almost makes that black plastic not a pure black anymore. So you'll notice you'll get more reflection the higher you set this up. But if you're going for a black plastic, you're probably going to want to keep it at mid-gray or lower to still try and communicate that look of black plastic. Now also, this does have a bit of roughness to it. Let me switch out the environment really quick so you can see something with more contrast. Okay, see this sharp reflection that we have here? Watch what happens when I increase this roughness value on our material parameter. See how it starts to break up and diffuse that reflection? That's what we want, because if you look at this material here, it's not perfectly reflective. It certainly doesn't have a high polish look to it. It feels more like a soft touch rubber. That's what your roughness is going to do. And a lot of times you'll just kind of want to go back and forth and tweak your roughness, tweak your specular color until you're happy with something that you like. Okay? Get it close as you can, but more than likely when you start setting up your final lighting, you'll go back and you'll tweak things a little bit more. Because really lighting and materials, they are separate things, but in a lot of ways they kind of go together. And you'll see more of that as we get into the lighting setup. Okay, so now that we have this, a lot of times materials are that you create are a good starting point for other materials on your model. So if I select this soft touch rubber here by pressing Shift left click and Shift right click to paste, I paste that material here. Now one thing to know about that is what that's going to do is that's going to link those materials. So if I make a change to that material, it's going to affect both of them. Now that's not really what I wanted in this particular case. I wanted to use this as a starting point for this material, but I don't want them to be linked. So after I paste them, I can right click on it and select unlink material. Now if I double click that material again and adjust its parameters, it's separate from the other one. All right, so the other thing we need to do here is go ahead and set up a glass on this material. So let's double click and let's change this from diffuse over to glass. And one thing I want to do is I want to make sure that this two-sided option is not checked. If we click two-sided, because this glass surface is really only one layer, there's one layer of polygon, so it doesn't actually have thickness, it's going to treat that whole interior portion as if it's solid glass, which it's not. So we're just going to keep two-sided unchecked. The other nice thing about keeping two-sided unchecked is you can adjust this refraction index, and you can make your glass more reflective, so you can get better highlights on it without actually creating too much distortion. So when I have two-sided checked, watch what happens. You actually get a little bit more distortion in there. So we're going to leave two-sided off. And the next problem that we need to address is, okay, we have some items under here that we need to be able to assign materials to. So how do you go about that? You right-click on here, and you select Hide Part. That's going to hide that layer. Now, if we look at the actual lens here, we've got these green numbers on top, and we have the white ones on the bottom. So let's go ahead and double-click these numbers here, and we'll change the material type from diffuse to plastic. And we'll set this to sort of a green value. And if you wanted, you could also sample your green value in Photoshop, find out what that exact RGB value is, and you could type it in here in KeyShot. But in the interest of time, we'll just go ahead and eyeball it. Okay. And so now that we've set that material, if I want to bring back that part, I can either right-click and do Undo Hide Part if I only wanted to bring back the most recently hidden part, or I can do Show All Parts if I had hidden multiple parts and want everything to come back. Let's go ahead and do Undo Hide Part, and that brings it back. Okay, the other thing here, double-click on the bottom, and this is a metal piece. So let's change this diffuse over to metal. And you'll notice when you're using KeyShot material, that KeyShot materials only give you the parameters that you need to create that particular material. For example, metal, you have color and you have roughness. So it makes it really easy to set up your own materials. And that's why I would definitely encourage all of you to experiment with the KeyShot materials and really start learning how to become self-sufficient and be able to create your own. Because at some point or another, you're going to come across a project where what you need to create isn't going to be in the KeyShot material library. And if you start practicing now, you'll be able to create that material when that situation comes up. Well, the next thing we want to do here is if we look at this, our lens is not exactly on the ground. Okay? So what I want to do is right-click and select Move Object. Let's get in here real close. And let's start to position this so that it's resting on the ground. Okay, there we go. So now it's resting nicely on the ground. And the next thing we have to start to think about is setting up our camera view. I want to do something similar to this view here because we are trying to reproduce this marketing image. And a lot of times with marketing images, when you do a profile view of a product, they're going to use a long lens, which basically flattens out the image and tries to get rid of perspective. That way you get a nice profile where you can really see the silhouette of this product with all the little crevices and different forms of the product so that they're communicated clearly from the side. So we have a way of doing that in KeyShot, and that's under the camera control. So if you go under here, what you can do is you can start to set your focal length. Now these camera controls behave like a real-world camera, which is really nice. So if you're familiar with photography at all, you should feel very comfortable in here. If you're not familiar with photography, I can give you a brief rundown here of what these do, and it should be pretty clear to you once we do that. So focal length, this is going to be more of a wide-angle lens. So what I mean by wide angle is imagine, like for example, if say an apartment is trying to do photos of the interiors of their apartment. Apartments might be kind of small, but if they go in there with a wide-angle lens, it's going to capture a wider field of view. It's going to make the apartment look bigger. And when people look at it on the internet, they think they're getting a big place when they're really not. So that's kind of what focal length will do. And if I reduce this down, look what happens. You get this exaggerated perspective. I mean, this lens feels huge, right? But if we zoom out and we increase this focal length, what we're doing here is, imagine you're at the zoo and you want to look at the tigers, but you don't want to get really close to the tigers because no one really wants to do that. So you pull out your zoom lens and you zoom in, and that's what increasing your focal length does for you. And what that's going to do is that's going to flatten out the perspective, like in that image that we saw, and we can start to get a very nice profile view of our product here. So we might go with something like a 100mm lens or a 150. And once you're happy with your view, it's really important that you go ahead and save out your camera. Okay, so let's go ahead and click this plus here, and this is going to be called Final Shot. Okay, so once you rename it, it's stored here in this camera drop-down list. Okay. Now, if I go ahead and make a change and I move my camera around and I'm editing materials, and it's like, okay, I want to get back to that camera view that I had because that's what the marketing department approved, and we need to be able to get back to that shot. You can click back here, and that sets your camera exactly to how it was. Now, one thing I haven't done during the course of this webinar, which is a mistake on my part, is save my work. You'll always want to save often. So let's call this camera lens final, and we'll save this out. And a lot of times what I do is I also save increments. I do camera lens final V2, because sometimes things happen, sometimes files corrupt, and you don't want to be in a situation where you've done a whole bunch of work and the deadline's coming down and something happens, you have to end up redoing all your work. So I suggest save often and save increments. Okay, the other thing we can do, if we look here at our image, the marketing image that we're reproducing, we have a white background. And here what we're seeing is we're seeing our lighting environment. Now you also have the option to set it as a solid color. Okay, so under the Environment tab in the Project window, which can be accessed by clicking the Project icon down here, or you can hit spacebar to bring the Project window back. You can access this. So if you set it to color, you can set any background color you want. We're going to go ahead and go with white. And basically the way we're going to render this out is we're going to set ourselves up in such a way that we can set this against any background color we want, and our shadow is going to blend seamlessly, and we'll be able to do this in Photoshop. So again, when the marketing department comes along and says, hey, that's great that you rendered out this really nice image with a red background color, but we need it in white, you don't want to have to go back and redo all that work. So I'm going to show you how to set it up so that you have ultimate flexibility with doing this. Okay. But before we get to the rendering portion, the next thing we kind of have to tackle here is our lighting. So again, if we look at this image, we have this highlight on the right, and we have this highlight on the left. Let's go ahead and talk about how we can do that. One way that you can adjust your lighting is you can press the up and down arrow. And what that's doing, if we look at the Environment tab, is that's taking your brightness and it's boosting it or decreasing it. So it's basically moving this slider, but you're doing it with a hotkey. Okay. So that increased our brightness, but that's still not giving us what we're looking for. We need a specific highlight that runs along this side, and we need a specific highlight that runs along this side. Just go ahead and save my work. I'm going to go ahead and go to this edit option. And if you're running the latest version of KeyShot, which is KeyShot 3.2, you're going to have this environment editor. And if you go into the pins option, you can add a pin. And what this pin is going to do is it's going to boost light in a certain area of your HDR. The other thing I'm going to do is go back to this adjustment, and I'm going to darken down my environment a little bit more. So we have less overall light, and what we're going to be focusing on more is this specific light boost area. So notice as I move this around, look what's happening. We're starting to position highlight on the right side of the lens like we want. Okay. Now remember what I said as far as lighting and materials kind of go hand in hand. I'm going to position this highlight where it needs to be, but more than likely we're going to have to go back and tweak these materials to create the look that we're going for. And the more that you do this, the more often you'll find that you're probably going to have to tweak lighting and materials for most any view or any scenario that you do. Okay, the other thing we can do with this pen is increase its brightness. Okay, and I like kind of the result that this is giving us here. And let's position it a little bit there. And I'm happy with this, and I basically need the same thing on this side. So what I can do is click duplicate, and if we shift this pen over, we can position the highlight on that side. It's like we'll need to go all the way to the other side to do this. So you can see what's happening here. We're starting to create that look there. Now, the main problem that we're seeing here, why this isn't looking like the image, is the roughness of this plastic material. So that's what we need to tweak next. If we click here and we go to our Textures tab, we can start to reduce this bump height. The other thing we can do is make sure that our diffuse color is all the way black. So now we're getting, definitely a better looking black plastic here. I would also still like a little bit more of those intense reflections here, because if we look at this image, we have a lot of contrast between the shadow and highlight areas. It's almost black on the outer edge, and we get a very bright highlight here on this plastic. So let's go ahead and work on that. Part of that's going to be the bump height as well. So under the Textures tab, with our bump map selected, we can reduce this bump height. Let's also increase the scale of it a little bit so we get a little bit heavier sort of texture. Now we're getting a lot closer to what we actually have in that marketing image there. Okay. One thing we forgot to do is edit the ring here. So the ring is also a plastic material. You can see some specular highlights there. Let's go ahead and double click on that. And let's change this from diffuse to plastic. And let's move the specular color up to somewhere around white. And let's give it a little bit of roughness. Even when I have highly polished plastic materials or any highly polished material in general, I generally do not leave the roughness at a value of 0, because 0 is just too perfect. There's nothing in the real world that is perfectly polished. Even, chrome is going to have some levels of imperfections to it. So if you leave it at 0, it's going to have a tendency to look too fake because it's too perfect. Okay, the other thing we need to do, if we look at this red here, it's a bit too saturated compared to this marketing image. So let's go ahead and reduce the saturation of that, and let's also knock back the brightness of this. Again, if your colors appear too saturated, that's another thing that's going to make your image look a bit fake. Okay, so now that we have this set up, let's go ahead and save our work, and I'm going to save an increment. If anything happens, just want to make sure that I'm covered up to this point. We'll save D3. All right. If you want, you can also turn off ground shadows. Okay, and that's done by going into the Environment tab. And you can also lighten the look of your shadow by clicking on the Shadow Color option. So if you're looking at your shadow and you say, I like it, but it's too dark, you can actually start to bring this up, and that's going to make your shadow appear more subtle. We'll go ahead and leave it at black for now, because we're going to tune this in Photoshop completely separate. Okay, now one thing we need to do, since we've edited our environment, is when you're making these edits, it basically reduces the size of your environment image so you can get fast real-time feedback. What you want to do is go ahead and generate high resolution for KeyShot, and it's going to export that HDR. Now you're done editing, and we can move on to the next step. I'm going to hop into Photoshop really quick and show you something about how these are rendered out. I just paused the interface by pressing Shift-P. And what that does is that drops the activity off on your processors, because KeyShot will use 100% of all processors in your system. When you pause it, that allows your processors to free up and will basically allow other applications to utilize your processors. So when bouncing back and forth between applications, I suggest using that Shift-P. Now, what we're going to set up next in KeyShot is basically this masks file. So what this is this creates flat shaders that you can use in Photoshop. Select your magic wand tool, and you can make precise selection of certain areas for your render. And the reason you want to do that is because if you need to control a certain element of your image, you can do so independently by selecting that. So for example, if we said, okay, this body needs to have more contrast, we can go to our exposure setting and we can increase or decrease our gamma. And we're only editing that particular portion. That's going to give you a lot of flexibility there. Let me show you how we go about setting that up. So what I like to do is I like to keep all of this into a single KeyShot file, and I'll explain to you why here in just a second. So I just right-click on this model in the scene tree, select Duplicate, and we're going to rename this to 50mm mask. Okay. So what that did is that gave us a duplicate of our model, and you can't tell, but basically we have two models sitting on top of each other inside KeyShot. I'm going to hide the other one by clicking the checkbox here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change this to a flat material. If I click and set a color on it, notice what this does. This basically renders a flat shader of this with no shading whatsoever. So that's going to allow you to effectively use that magic wand tool in Photoshop to easily make a selection. When you're setting up your flat shaders, I suggest not going with things that have a lot of contrast next to each other. You see how, we have red and green here, which have high contrast. That's going to give you a very sharp selection in Photoshop, and you might notice some rough edges when you make your selection. So I try to select colors that are very similar to each other, but have just enough difference that the magic wand tool can tell the difference between them in Photoshop. Okay? So the nice thing about this is once you have your masks file set up, you can bring back your final render. So if you need a quick render of whatever you set up, you can always do that. And if you're deciding to go the extra mile and isolate things into different elements, you have all that readily available to you, even if you change camera views. So once it's all set up, if you decide you want one from this side, you have your masks file and you have your final render all in the same KeyShot file. Okay, let's go ahead and pause this. Now, when you render all this out, basically, I render everything in 32 bits, and I will basically, I'll do a 32-bit render of our nicely lit, nicely accurate material model here. And then I'll do just the standard 8-bit render of our mask. And the reason is, if you remember with the 32-bit images, when I was pulling out highlights and shadows, if you ever overexpose or underexpose an area, like in this metal here, how this highlight is completely blown out, you can always pull that detail back in Photoshop. So that's why I do a 32-bit render of your materials, and then I do an 8-bit render of your mask. You don't need the 32-bit for your mask. Okay, when you get to the rendering portion, there are webinars out there that cover the render settings themselves. We are running out of time here, so I won't dive into those too much. But one of the nice things about rendering things at high resolution, say 4,000 pixels by 2,092 pixels, is you can go really low on these samples. Like you can set a value of 8. And one thing you should know about samples is when you start increasing those, your render time can potentially increase exponentially. So you only want to increase these if you know that you need them. And like I said, the nice thing about rendering things at high resolution, you can save a lot of render time by knocking that back. Ray bounces are important only for transparent materials. so you shouldn't need to mess with those. And really, you'll just want to take a look at either the manual or some of the render settings webinars that exist out there online, and that will explain a lot to you. I've already pre-rendered these elements so that I can show you how they get put together in Photoshop. And so let's go ahead and start building that from the different elements that I rendered. So I have these pre-rendered, and let's go ahead and open up our first one. Okay. Okay, so here's the first image that I rendered. And notice we have this transparency back here because I rendered with an alpha channel. What you want to do as soon as you get into Photoshop is go to Layer, Layer Mask from Transparency, and then go to in your Layers palette, right-click on here and just select Delete Layer Mask. You always have your masks file that you rendered out to be able to create a nice selection of them. I'll show you that as we piece this all together, and it'll make more sense. Now notice I also rendered this without the shadow. Shadows are incredibly important when creating marketing images. Every element of the image is important because basically that's what's communicating this product to the world. So you'll notice that marketing teams are very particular about what an image looks like, and rightfully so, because it helps communicate their brand. Now, if we go in here and we select another image that I have rendered out, this is the shadow. And I'll show you how we can go about putting that on another layer. I'll just press Control-A to select everything in this layer, Control-C, and in here I'll press Control-Shift-V to paste it in place. Okay? And you can always do a little bit of nudging using the arrow keys if it doesn't quite line up. But for the most part, that paste in place shortcut should work. Now let's also open up the masks file. Okay. What I'm going to do is Control-A and Control-C to select and copy that. And also, I'm going to convert this to an 8-bit image. As you'll notice, with a lot of 32-bit images, your standard tools are not going to work in Photoshop. And that's just a limitation that Photoshop has. But I like to keep my 32-bit renders there on the side if I ever need to pull out detail and highlights and shadows. Okay, so now that we have our mask file in here, if I press Control and click on that in the layer, look what we have. We have a nice selection of our model there. And then what I can do is I can go to this first layer that had our camera on there, and I can press Control-J. And that gave me a really nice selection of the camera lens by itself. So what we've done by pressing Control-J is we've duplicated that camera lens layer, and we put it on a layer all by itself. Okay? And let me show you kind of why we go about doing all of this. Remember what I said as far as doing shadows? A lot of times marketing teams are very particular about how they look. We can create a new layer underneath all of this, and we can set it to a red color. So red. And look what happens there. With our shadow layer, we get this gradation. We have white blending in with that gray. So what you want to do with your shadow layer is basically set that to multiply inside Photoshop, and that's going to blend your shadow with whatever exists underneath. So you can set any background color you want, and it's never going to be a problem. And again, it's all about giving yourself flexibility to make changes. The other thing I'm going to point out to you here is when separating things in Photoshop, look here, we have this sort of white pixel fringe on this camera lens. Let's fix that. If we click here, and you go to Layer, Matting, Defringe, select 1 pixel, and that gets rid of that for you. Okay? And what you can do now is you can basically have free reign to go over your image, use your mask to select any elements of this render that you want, and control all of this independently. If you wanted to make your shadow darker, you could simply duplicate that layer. And now you have a darker shadow. You know, if you wanted to make it lighter, you could simply knock back the opacity. And it's really, really easy. So when you're doing this, you know, KeyShot work for marketing purposes, the setup is a bit more involved than if you're doing it for design evaluation amongst your design or engineering teams. But the purpose of all the additional setup is to give yourself maximum control, because that's where it really matters. When your images go out and communicate to the world what this product is, companies are very particular about how those look. So you have to be able to set yourself up to make changes and accomplish the goals that they're going to look for in their marketing images. So that's about it for today. It looks like we are running out of time, and I do want to leave time for some questions. I know that was a lot of information, but certainly you can go back and watch the webinar, and you know, more than welcome to ask questions now, and I can help clarify any questions that you have.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and jump into some questions here. The first one we'll get to here is from Ricardo. He said, can we make an environment from a backplate image?
Basically, you can do things like that. And KeyShot ships with those sort of things, and let me show you how that works. You can't take a standard 8-bit image and create an environment image, and that gets back to this whole thing that I was telling you about. An 8-bit image is only going to have 0 to 255, and that's not enough range to actually create light from an image. Your 32-bit image is going to have enough range to do that. So if you have special cameras, you can create your own lighting environment. If not, let me show you how typically this works. So if we grab this office desk environment, go in here and turn off ground. Set this as a lighting environment. If you look here, this is what's lighting our model right now. Now this environment shifts with KeyShot, and what you can do is you can set a backplate image. And there are also standard images that shift with KeyShot, standard 8-bit images that, go along with the environment as well. So if we go to interior office desk, we can select something like this. And basically what this is doing is this is using the lighting environment that we set, and it's using that backplate as the background image, and we can composite this interactively into the scene. You can still use the up and down arrows to lighten or darken your environment. If I darken this all the way down, basically you'll see that this model gets really dark and it doesn't fit within the backplate very well. So what you want to do is adjust your brightness to sort of match the overall brightness of the backplate, and you can create some really convincing image composites very quickly. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great. Let's get to another one here. This one's from Larry. He's asking, when you edit a material by double-clicking an object, is that edit made global or just to your selection?
It's made to whatever objects have that material assigned. And let me go ahead and explain that again. So, for example, if I double-click on this red ring right here, I can change this to, say, a green color. And if you look in your scene tree, this is going to show you all the parts, how your model is broken up. So if you see a separate element here, these are all the elements that you can assign a different material to. Okay? So notice this focus ring right here, it's its own little element, and you can see that it's highlighted. If we click on the body, it's a separate element. But if I take this material and copy it by pressing Shift left click, Shift right click to paste, that copies this material and links the two. So now if I make a change, it affects both of them. Okay? If I wanted to just copy that material, paste it, and then not have those two be linked, I could right click and select unlink material after pasting it. And now if I click, notice that that is separate from the ring itself. Okay. So hopefully that clarifies that for you.
Great. Let's get to another one here. This one's from Mike. He's asking, when it comes to transparent objects, for example, clear plastic, could you maybe touch briefly on importing the model and what attributes should be set?
Sure, absolutely. let me create an example here to kind of better explain transparent materials. It's very important that these are modeled correctly to be able to be rendered correctly. The important thing is that whatever model you create needs to have thickness. So for example, if I just create a sphere here, right? And let me create another one. But this one, I'm going to extrude these faces inward so that this sphere actually has thickness. So we'll go to Edit Mesh, Extrude, and we'll bring these in. And what we have here now, we have a sphere that has surface thickness to it. Okay. So let's go ahead and assign a different material to this, and we'll export this as an OBJ and import into KeyShot. We'll go call this transparent test, and we'll export selection. And let's just start a new session of KeyShot, and I'll explain that for you. Okay, so here's our transparent test. Okay, so basically we have one of these has surface thickness and the other does not. So if we set this to, say, a glass material, and we copy and paste, and I'll unlink these, you can see what we have going on here. If I click this and I select two-sided, what's happening here, let me just bring in a different environment, a little more clear. Okay, so what's happening here is because this only has one layer of polygons, it's treating this object as it is a solid piece of glass because refraction is calculated from one set of polygons over to the other side. So it's looking at this as this is solid. Okay? If we go over to this material and we set two-sided, look at the difference. The refraction is occurring only where you have the first set of polygons and then you have the next set. So it's important that when you're creating glass or transparent objects, that if there is actual surface thickness to that glass, that you actually model that in there. It's really important. You can go into the library, and it does have scientifically accurate material. So if you're looking for a transparent plastic, say a clear plastic of some sort, you can come in here and just grab a clear shiny plastic and drop it on there, and it's going to be accurate. But notice, like I said, for example, because this only has one layer of polygons, it's treating it as solid, and you get quite a bit more distortion in there. And it also flips that image upside down. Notice in this one, we're looking at the ceiling in the reflection. Like I said, because this is basically treating it as a crystal ball. The main thing with transparent objects is their index of refraction. You can look up index of refraction online, and basically every material out there has an index of refraction, and let me quickly explain to you what that is. This is the KeyShot 3 manual, and if we go to the rendering output, material types in their settings, and you look at refraction index, here's a great example of that. Every object out there has an index of refraction. For example, water has one of around 1.3. Glass has an index of refraction around 1.5. And I mean, everything from polypropylene to plastic, they all have that out there. And if you set that value in here, you're going to get an accurate representation. For example, if this was some sort of water with food coloring, I could set 1.33, and what that's doing is that's distorting that the same way as water would. It's all scientifically accurate. And for example, let me show you this. Air has an index of refraction of 1. If I hit 1, look what happens. It's no distortion. Just like when we're walking around about our daily lives, we don't see things that look distorted until we actually look at them through something like glass. Glass has an index of refraction of 1.5, so if I type in 1.5 and press enter, now you get the distortion. So it largely comes down to your index of refraction. What I would suggest, if you're not too familiar with those properties as far as your transparent materials are concerned, pull them from the library. Come into the, look for glass or transparent plastics and get them from there, because they're already tuned to be scientifically accurate. Okay, so hopefully that clears that up for you.
Yeah, that's great. We'll just get to a couple more here. This one's from Justin. He's asking, after applying decals or labels to a material, if I want to select a new pre-made material, can I maintain the placement and size of the decal without having it deleted?
Unfortunately, no, because the decals are tied to materials. I imagine that's something that will change in the future. I know it has been discussed that essentially labels should be separate from materials. So in the current version, the answer is unfortunately no.
I see. So I think we'll just get to one last question here, and this one's sort of a follow-up, I guess. It's from Justin again. He's wondering, can you share with us the CAD model in native form as well as the KeyShot file? I guess they want it for to compare with.
Yeah, the CAD model is here. I would have to basically, you would have to email this user here to, find out if it would be okay for us to distribute that KeyShot file. But I'm sure we can. Vince, you and I can send an email off to him and see if he would be okay with us distributing that KeyShot file. So
Yeah.
if you go to graphics.com, you can go to this Canon EF 50 millimeter. This is going to have the actual file itself. So you can download that for free from there. You would need an account, so you just have to click register up here on GrabCAD. It's a free account, and then you can download this model and play with it. One thing I can do is I can definitely include the Photoshop file. So if you want the Photoshop file, I can be sure and compress that up, and you can have the Photoshop file to see how everything is all set up.
Yeah, so I guess we'll have Brian email that to me, and then I'll email that to everyone else as a follow-up email. That way everyone can get a hold of that. So yeah, I think we'll hold the Q&A there. I want to switch the screen over to me really quick and give a brief send-off before we go. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Brian. Tremendous presentation, really informative stuff. I'm sure everyone out there enjoyed it as much as I did. And yeah, again, I want to thank everyone for attending another episode, Novedge's Best of the Best webinar series. Just in case you're unfamiliar with us here at Novedge, we're the leading online design software superstore. Not only do we have the best prices around, our staff is extremely awesome, incredibly knowledgeable. We would love for you to call and chat with us at any time. We do have KeyShot. There is a best price guarantee on that. If you have any questions about purchasing it, don't hesitate to email my colleague Bob Thayer at bob@novedge.com. He would love to chat with you about getting your hands on KeyShot. And then the last thing I want to talk briefly about before we go here is an online community we've created here called Rhino Jungle. It's not just for Rhino users. We have a lot of KeyShot users who are on there who discuss their experiences with KeyShot. It's a great place to get news, trends, tutorials, all things related to sort of 3D CAD and rendering. So if you're not already a member, it's free. It's easy to sign up. Definitely give it a chance if you're interested. So again, I want to thank everyone. This webinar will be made available online, and we'll email everyone the links to it as soon as it's done processing. But yeah, having said all that, I don't know, Brian, is there anything you wanted to add really quick before we go here?
Just one other thing. I'll go ahead and send you the link to the Photoshop file, and also give you the link to the GrabCAD location for that lens. Yeah. So you can go ahead and, if you want to post that underneath the webinar, it'd be a good resource for the users to follow along. Yeah,
I definitely will. I'll include both of those. So yeah, everyone who wants to get a hold of those will be able to find them pretty easily. So yeah, again, thank you, Brian, and thank you all for attending. We'll catch everyone next time.
All right, thank you.